Okay, so I'm going to hop between two different PowerPoints for this one because I think some of what your book talks about in this particular section about why people migrate is missing a couple of things that our other book that we've used in years past really kind of covers much better. So, with that being said, um, I want to start. This is key issue number 3, so I'm just going to start with key issue number 3, and I don't think I'll get to 4. But it gives you some basics in this particular section about the reasons why people migrate, your push and pull factors, and most of this is pretty why do people leave a place? Mostly it's economic, but the 3 major types they listed are political, environmental, and economic. Now, in the Ethel Wood book, it does mention cultural instead of political, but it throws political and governmental changes uh, in that cultural section. So it's in this particular instance, it's one and the same. But what I wanted to talk about predominantly was your political factors. The UNHCR is a term you guys need to know. It's the UN High Commissions for Refugees. They recognize the 3 different refugee, internally displaced person, IDP, or asylum seeker. You might want to put, in fact, right now, pause and put the acronym on a note card for UNHCR and for IDP. Put the acronym on the note card and the definition behind it, and put that in your GBOC, okay? Because those are kind of important. The UN is a significant piece of this puzzle for the refugee status. And our Oliver talked about, or the Miss Durbin talked about what the difference was between refugee and asylum seeker. And the initial difference really is refugee seeks the status and safety of a country before they get there, and asylum seekers get to the country and then they ask for asylum. Okay, once they've already been in the country. So that's the major difference. This map is really kind of important. It kind of talks about and shows you, and since I'm a visual learner, this is helpful, shows you the difference in the countries that are the source of the refugees, okay? And what I find interesting is that your refugees are coming from your Iraq, Afghanistan, Turkey, Russia, and the destination of the refugees are in Iran, Pakistan, India, okay, Yemen, France, Germany, the United States. Some of those countries strike me as a little strange as far as the destinations of where some of the refugees would be headed. They also talk about the environmental factors that can prompt migration, mountains, seaside, why people would want to live in particular climates. The 2 things that if you're looking at examples of environmental push or pull factors, they showed an example of the flooding in the Mississippi. People live by rivers, okay? That's going to be the norm because you want to live by, again, mostly water. But they also know that there's a risk, okay, especially in places like along the Mississippi. The Nile used to flood. In Egypt, it doesn't anymore simply because they've dammed it. But they haven't dammed the Mississippi. And so because of that, the Mississippi does tend to flood from time to time. And those that live there know that, okay? And they also mentioned an example of the Sahel. And on page 93 in your book, it mentions the capacity of the Sahel to sustain human life, which is never very high, has declined recently because of population growth and several years of unusually low rainfall. Consequently, many of these nomads that typically live there in the Sahel have been forced to move into the cities. So not only does environmental push factors force people out, when you're looking at people that are moving from a nomadic lifestyle into the city, you're completely changing their culture. And that's what's really kind of important to note. And something, a nugget to chew on, something to think about when you're perhaps writing or thinking about when people migrate. You're looking at people that if they're moving from rural, and in the case of the Sahel, nomadic lifestyle into a city environment, that's a drastic change. And one of the things they mentioned was that this is, in order for these nomads to survive, they live off of food donated by the government and international relief. They haven't been trained for jobs. They haven't been, they're not prepared for that kind of lifestyle. Their lifestyle is nomadic. And to switch them from that kind of lifestyle into a city, an urban dwelling, is completely a 180 for them. And so that's something that doesn't always get mentioned, but is still important to talk about. Most people do migrate for economic reasons, okay? You leave places with few jobs, you go to places that have jobs readily available. The US and Canada have been the most prominent for economic migrants, okay? And then it does mention intervening obstacles, okay? Things that keep people from, okay? Then they talk about environmental features like mountains or oceans or the distance itself, or a political feature. Countries require proper documentation. So reasons why people could, again, keep from migrating as far as they would want to. Okay. And these are intervening obstacles. Our other book, Deblis, one that you don't have, talks about the opportunity. And the difference in those two terms is simply that if you're looking at intervening opportunity, it's when most people along the way to their final destination find other jobs that suffice them to the point that they don't move beyond that. Okay, that's different than obstacles. Obstacles are literally things that are keeping you from moving forward. Opportunities are just things that get in your, not necessarily in your way, but again, something that keeps you from moving as far as you wanted to because something else came up. Okay, so keep those two things in mind. It also talks about countries have adopted selective immigration policies, the Quota Act of 1921, the let's see, 1924, National Origins Act. It also talks about the quotas for individual countries replaced with hemisphere quotas for the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. And lists all of that on page. Oh, that's actually key issue 4. Oh, I don't really want to get into that right now. What I do want to talk about is more specifically not necessarily where do people migrate, but these Ravenstein's laws of migration. I also want you to know that if you ever see the term gravity model, that's what it's talking about. Okay, so this goes back to, again, a chapter section in the Deblis book that does, I think, a little bit better job of explaining in detail why people migrate. Okay, we know that there's push and pull factors, but there's also specific times in history where those were truly evident. Okay, I've listed a few here. We've talked about some of them. The Irish potato famine. Okay. The Atlantic slave trade is something we haven't mentioned before in class. The exploitation of West Africa. If you're to look at this map here, you would see, I'm going to open this up, you would see where most of our African slaves came from, okay, and where they went. Okay, they came from West Africa, and most of them went to either South America, Latin America, the Caribbean. Not as bad as slavery was here in the United States, and the reason why it gets such a bad rap is it's how it was systematically done. What people don't think about is in Africa, slaves were traded by other African tribal leaders, okay? And nobody really ever talks about that. But because it was such a black and white, literally a black and white issue here in the United States and how it was done, and it was they abolished it in England first, in Britain first. But it was the systematic way that we handled slavery here in the United States that forever has tarnished the nation, essentially. So, but it just kind of gives you an idea of where the slaves actually went and what part of Africa they came from. Okay. And then there's other parts of Australia being set up as a penal colony, and where most of the prisoners were overcrowding in England set up the penal colony in Australia. And again, that was more of uh, they were indentured servants. Some of them, they weren't your, serial killers. It's not like Australia was the descendants of serial killers, but they were um, people who owed money and that kind of thing. That's just why they were thrown in prison. So we also have the Trail of Tears, the Soviet Union. I mentioned this in third period. We briefly talked about it in fourth period, A-Day. But the collectivization, the movement of people to the east of Russia during the Soviet Union to create farms and farmland and cotton and everybody's got a job and those kind of things. All of that is part of your why people migrate section. Okay, Nazi Germany. Okay, why people left Germany, and then of course the counter migration where people are actually forced to go back to their countries because the governments actually send them back. Here in the United States, they talked. Ms. Durbin talked about the fact that if you were somebody who was seen as a political not a political risk, but somebody who had done something bad in the country you came from, it's not a guarantee that the United States or any country would give you asylum. Okay, they would probably send you back. Okay, that's not something that the United States wants. Is somebody that's wanted for murder or wanted for something terrible in the other country they left. Okay, what I wanted to mention here is your Ravenstein's laws of migration. It's also called the gravity model. Okay, and it essentially states here that here's your intensity of you've got slight, low, moderate, high, and very high. Okay, and this little curve, this little ramp here, talks about the distance, the small distance of interaction and how strong it is. Okay, versus your interaction that's slight and how large it is. So what this essentially says is that and just like your distance decay, many migrants settle closer to their old home than they originally contemplate. Okay, I liken this to my own migration. I moved up here to Dallas for an economic reason, for a job. Even though I had a job, but I moved up here. My husband moved me, and I can tell you I wouldn't move any further because it would be further away from my parents. My distance decay is that if I move further away from Houston, then I am really pushing the limit as to how many times a year that I would actually get to see my parents and the rest of my family that live down in Houston. So the gravity model simply states, where's my Ravenstein? Okay, that the majority of migrations move a short distance. Okay, and that the further they move, migrants who move longer distances tend to choose big city destinations. And again, that the further they move, the less likely they are going to have the interaction with family back home, okay? Which is why a lot of migrants tend to move shorter distances. And that's all this is saying. That's what the gravity model says. It predicts the interaction between places on the basis of their population size. The gravity model assumes spatial interaction is directly related to the populations and inversely related to the distance. So, again, basically saying all of that to say that the closer you are to your original home base of where you started, the more likely chance you are of having interaction between that. That makes sense, right? And that's essentially the idea of distance decay. Okay. So I wanted you to see that because anytime you see anything that's talking about the gravity model, that's essentially what Ravenstein was talking about. Okay. And in this particular book, it talks about specific types of migration. Step migration, where a migrant follows a series of stages or steps toward a final destination where you get a job and then maybe you move further and you don't let the intervening opportunity keep you from your final destination. You just use that as a stepping stone to the next dot on the map for you. Okay, and then of course chain migration is basically how the United States was settled. Okay, people wrote home in Texas once they got here, how beautiful it was, how gorgeous the landscape was, believe it or not, the rivers. People wrote home saying, "Oh, this is so great! You've got to come here." Okay, And that's where you get the immigrants in your towns that are set up, like the German towns and Schlitterbahn and Little Italy and, well, Italy, Texas, I guess, um, Paris, Texas. That's where you get these names, these toponyms that come in because that's, again, the chain migration has helped set up kind of an enclave of people from the same community, from the same country, speak the same language. And that's where you get a lot of your names from here in the United States. It's from some of that chain migration that has set up these towns. And again, as I said before, Ravenstein in your book doesn't necessarily list, 5 different laws of migration. Um, Ethel Wood lists it as 4, but your basic principle is that your migration flow, there's always a return flow or counter migration. Um, that majority of migrants move short distances, okay, and that migrants move longer distances, tend to go to the cities. Your urban residents are less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas, and families are less likely to make the international move than the young adults are going to be the ones that do it more quickly than whole families, and that's international. We've talked before in this class about how NAFTA has created this new immigrant picture for the United States, where your Mexican families are moving over, not just the younger men in the family or the fathers in the family. It's the whole family coming over and staying permanently. And that's really kind of been the unintended consequence of NAFTA. So, and the other thing, push and pull factors, it talks about a lot of things in this book that ours did not. It mentions very briefly in your book about the power relationships, about gender. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that um, when it mentions the fact that, well, I'll use that in another PowerPoint because this one's kind of gone long. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this in the next PowerPoint or in the next video.